Hey folks, let's chat about how the war affected Americans at home. This section is called Mobilizing the Homefront. So after watching this video, you should be able to explain how war impacts people at home and explain 2 ways wartime mobilization impacted the domestic lives of citizens in the U.S. during the early 1940s. This is a test question. So I want you to really think about this as you are doing your questions at the end. It'll help you for your test. Okay, so let's talk about context first. Mobilization is one of those key terms that we studied on the vocab day a long time ago. And I just want to give you a refresher here that mobilization is when troops, supplies, and civilians get ready for war. They mobilize. And an example of this is all of the things that we're going to be talking about in this video. So keep that in mind. Another piece of context that I need you to know is that when the U.S. enters the war in 1941, the U.S. is actually pulled out of the Great Depression. How, you might ask? Unemployment is really pretty much solved because of the draft and a higher rate of production during wartime. So you know that the draft means that men who are of age, 18 or older, can be called by the government to fight in war if there's not enough people volunteering. So during World War II, the draft was instituted. So this gives a lot of able-bodied men jobs. So what that means is people who are left over, like women, also become employed because the jobs that those men once held are now open. So we're going to continue to talk about that. But the factory production really picks up to produce weapons and supplies for the war effort, and you've got a lot of people working. So unemployment is down to like 1.2% by the end of the war in the United States. So the first thing that we're going to talk about, one part of American society that was mobilized were the women. And women served 2 specific roles that I want to talk about during World War II. So first of all, let's talk about the Women Army Corps, which is depicted here. You can see them in their uniforms, and you can see a propaganda poster here trying to convince women to join. The Women Army Corps were trained in basic training, and what they did was they filled clerical positions. So oftentimes they would be doing paperwork for the Army, and eventually women started becoming electricians, radio controllers, air traffic controllers. So they filled a lot of positions in the actual Army, and they were deployed anywhere that the men were fighting. So some of the women were deployed in Northern Africa, some of them in Europe, some of them in the Pacific. Another role that women played during World War II was working in factories. So this was new for women. About 6.5 million women, 6.5 million total, became involved in some sort of job during World War II. So you have to think about, as I said before, the men are no longer able to fill these positions because they're fighting in the war. So the women really step in. Women built ships. They learned how to weld. They build weapons and aircrafts. Women really come into these new places during World War II. So now let's talk about African Americans and Native Americans during the war. Minorities contributed to the war drastically. And, the saying goes, or the campaign that was started is called the Double V, for double victory. And African American newspapers were promoting that African Americans really show support for the U.S. in the war So that way, when they came home from fighting or after they had helped produce weapons in a factory or whatever role that they served, that they could really argue that they deserve to be first-class citizens instead of second-class citizens. They support their country and they want their country to support them. So that double V stands for, a victory in Europe against tyranny and oppression, and also a victory at home for equality and democracy. So I've got a really influential group of African American men here. I don't know if you remember from your vocab packet, but these are the Tuskegee Airmen. And these men were pilots, and they served as escorts for the bomber planes during World War II. Very influential, and one of the first all African American military units ever. And then you also have contributions of Native Americans in the war. So these are the Navajo code breakers. So these men were a part of the Navajo tribe, and they actually worked for the United States to help decode messages or encrypt or code messages that the U.S. was sending out. And they played a really big role fighting in the Pacific. So these men could decode something in 20 seconds, whereas it would take a machine about 30 minutes to do that. So they were very impressive. One more thing I want to say. Even though these African American men, women, these Native American men contributed to the war effort, they were still discriminated against. They still fought against racism, and this, double victory at home and abroad was never really realized. So keep that in mind moving forward. Okay, let's talk about the cost of war, right? So we've got women working in war, we've got minorities working in the war, we've got all of the men fighting because of the draft. The Great Depression has ended, but the war still costs money. So the United States deals with this in two different ways. The first way, which is really easy to remember, is a victory tax. And this is really just a tax hike where the people pay more to help fund the war. So the other thing that I want to discuss is war bonds, and sometimes these are called liberty bonds. So this is when the government asks the people for loans. So the United States government says, we need money. So we need the American people to give us money. And if they lend us money, then we'll pay back that money with interest. So ideally, if you donated $10 at the beginning of the war, you would be able to keep that bond until whenever you want it. You could keep it until today and cash it in and make money off of the interest that had been paid to you. So this is really important because it gives the United States government immediate money. This is important. It gives the U.S. government immediate money. However, it actually results in more debt for the government in the future because they're having to pay this interest back to all of these people that had loaned money. So again, immediate money to fight the war. However, it actually raises debt for the future. Okay, so another way that people are mobilized or people are affected by the war is they're forced to ration and conserve their products. So rationing means to restrict or conserve the amount of an item that somebody can have. So for instance, food, gasoline, rubber, any type of steel, metal, aluminum, all of these things were rationed. You can see here, there's a clothing book. You can only buy so many garments of clothing. And then the Ministry of Food here, you can see food was also rationed. You could only have so much sugar, so much bread, whatever. And this is because the bulk of the food supply was going to support the troops during the war that were fighting. So you also have victory gardens. And victory gardens are this idea of the U.S. government to promote civilians to grow their own food in their backyard. So ideally, if civilians are growing their own food and vegetables, then more food can go towards the troops. And then the last thing about rationing and conservation is scrap metal drives. So the U.S. government used to sponsor these scrap drives, and people would bring their spare parts to, the location and dump it. The government would then take that to factories and make new things out of it. So one more thing, I kind of talked about this earlier, but production really goes up in factories because, everything is going towards the war effort. So many companies that were not previously producing parts for the war or supplies for the war are completely converted from peacetime production, which is, the normal supplies that they would create, to wartime production. So here you can see a Procter & Gamble, a P&G ad. Some of your parents might work at P&G, or you might know that that's a company that has its base in Cincinnati. And they're saying, we're proud of every American fighting man. We've done our part with his food and equipment. So P&G was actually converted to this company called the Procter & Gamble Defense Corporation during the war. And they, all of the production, instead of going towards consumer goods, went towards wartime supplies. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to talk to you about is Japanese internment camps during the war. This is one other way that American civilians were affected by World War II. And what happened was, after the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States government was really afraid of some type of sabotage, that the Japanese were able to somehow attack Americans on American soil again. So, as a reaction to that, the president passed this executive order saying that Japanese Americans had to be forcibly relocated, which means they were forced to move to these internment camps. You can see these relocation centers and internment camps where they would no longer threaten United States security. And these living conditions were terrible in the internment camps. Here you can see the barracks that look very similar to what we think of when we think of concentration camps. There was no running water, there was no heat or air conditioning. Oftentimes people were given very little food, or they were forced to grow their own. So somebody took this issue to the Supreme Court in the 1940s, and it was upheld, which means that the United States government said that this is constitutional. However, 50 years later, the United States looked back into this, and they actually ended up paying reparations, or forgiveness payments to the Japanese Americans who were forcibly interned in these camps during World War II. So, what I'd like you to do is answer your questions and flip your card to green.